we've covered quite a range of possible futures in this discussion. Some areas we see widely divergent policy prescriptions and perhaps in a few closer alignment. Obviously, election outcomes down ballot will also affect future implementation of policy. I'd now like to turn to a few career-related questions from our students. Joining us for this portion of the program are Sabrina Roberts, who's class of 21 at the college, majoring in international politics and economics. We have Ash Hamad, class of 20 at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, pursuing a master's in international policy and development and international trade and economic diplomacy. We also have Jasmine Owens, class of 21 at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, pursuing a master's in non-proliferation and terrorism studies. And lastly, we have Drew Platt, class of 21 at the college, majoring in global security studies. So Sabrina, why don't you kick us off with questions?
Yes, of course. So thank you, Dr. Haass and Mr. Matthiesen. This has been super interesting. We've all really enjoyed it. I'm wondering, so we know that working for a federal government agency, a think tank, an NGO, or just in DC in general is impacted by politics, especially during the year of a presidential election. And I'm wondering, which of these careers would you say are more stable during periods of political change? And which of these career paths are in highest demand during times of political change?
Go ahead, Chris.
I'll just say briefly, I think, within the federal government, I alluded to it earlier, there are career positions and there are political positions. The career positions generally stay there. They've gotten a little more political of late, as you may have noticed. But I think, there are a lot of positions, a lot of agencies, at least on the domestic side, and I'm sure even probably more so, Dr. Haass can speak to it. But I think, within the government, there's that. But in the think tanks, they're going to be operating regardless. Firms like mine are operating regardless if they're prepared. So there's a lot of jobs out there, and the political jobs are still there too. There might be a few less, and those are good ways to get into the other stuff as well.
Yeah, I mean, most of the jobs are not affected by politics. Think about the military, the intelligence, the foreign service. These are career positions. Every president, by the way, when I'll say he gets elected, because there's only been he so far, there's about 4,000 political appointments this individual makes. That's it's the top layer, but it's a pretty thin layer, because that's the entire government. So that butter spread pretty thin on the bread. So most of the jobs in career bureaucracy are just that. They're career bureaucracy on the civilian side or the specialty side. So there's an enormous number of positions. It's different, and the election year is obviously different for the Congress. Indeed, it was my first job was in the Senate, and I often recommend that. It's an easier place sometimes to break in. And and they have their own political cycles, obviously state and local. I mean, in New York City, for example, where I hang out usually, we're about just over a year away, 14 months away from a mayoral election. And most of the city council is also going to be turning over. So there'll be, so there's both career jobs, but there's political jobs, and campaigns can be great ways to get involved. And then often, if you're lucky enough to choose the right candidate, and then there's whether it's lobbying or think tanks or academics or NGOs, it actually turns out only a small percentage of the jobs are affected by politics. Let me say one other thing, because Jeff and I talked about this. If you happen to be a conservative and there's a liberal power that be in Washington, or if you tend to be progressive and there's a more conservative, I wouldn't let that totally throw you. I think when you're in the starting out phase of careers, I think there's a powerful argument, particularly at the federal level, for getting experience and tooling up and getting smart. No one's going to hold it against you if you're 26 years old and you're working in the bowels of the Pentagon or the State Department or wherever. At this point, tooling up, learning how government works, picking up skills and so forth, seems to me really important. You'll have then decades to ultimately pay back. And as you get more senior, yeah, then you have to make slightly more political calls. Do you want to work for this individual or in this policy environment? But I think starting out, you kind of get a freebie or two. You get a couple of passes, and just to get the experience, to get smarter, get exposed, and it's also a great way to figure out, what you're interested in and so forth. So I wouldn't be put off. I mean, again, so let's, on the assumption that a lot of people here lean more towards the progressive end, might not be voting for President Trump if he were to be reelected. I wouldn't therefore say I would never go to Washington then. The question is, can you still learn? Can you still make a difference at whatever level you're there? So don't let the high level politics necessarily dictate your choices.
It's even more of a reason to come and participate and learn. And I think a good, a politician would want all manner of opinions under him or her. So I agree.
Good advice. Ash, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. First, thank you both for your time and your insights. My question really surrounds our discussion about multilateralism and our current administration's kind of skepticism of the multilateral system. However, it hasn't really just been all bark, demonstrated by their withdrawal from the World Health Organization. So my question to you both is, could this be the first step in a series of US withdrawals from multilateral institutions? And what does the future look like for the WTO, for example, under a second Trump term and conversely, a potential Biden term?
Just to be clear, the withdrawal from the World Health Organization was the most recent. You've had the United States withdraw from the 2015 Iran nuclear agreement. We've already talked about the Paris climate deal. The United States did not participate in the global compact. On migration, we've pulled back from certain trade agreements, including the TPP. So there's a pattern here. There's a pattern here. And I would think it continues in Trump 2.0, and it's changed if there's a Biden administration. I think it represents a really very different philosophy about America's, the way it deals with the world. And you'd have to go back in some ways probably to the Jacksonian tradition in American foreign policy to see certain elements of Mr. Trump. And Joe Biden is very much, as they say on Saturday Night Live, Joe Biden is very much in the tradition of, I would say, pretty much from Truman through Obama, and Republicans and Democrats alike, and essentially working with alliances, working with the institutions, many created in the aftermath of World War II. So it's this split between unilateralism versus multilateralism, and a willingness to see allies as partners rather than as competitors. So it's a fundamentally different worldview, which has real implications, really on virtually every issue.
I wouldn't have a ton to add. We got a heavy on the international policy, given that it's Middlebury, and I understand that, but I agree with that. And I think, regardless of what happens, and Richard alluded to it earlier, the Capitol Hill, the Senate, the House, the committees, it's a good place to start. If you are kind of disagree with the policy perspective and that's important to you, there's somebody there for you to go work for, and you can then work your way into a position where you're influencing some of these decisions in a future president or whoever it may be, and that's important to note.
Jasmine.
Hi, my question will be dealing with nuclear weapons and nuclear policy, and I guess it may be geared more towards Dr. Haass, but I wanted to ask, how do you see the nuclear policy field being impacted by the election results? Do you think we'll see increased focus on modernization, disarmament, et cetera? And additionally, do you think there will be a decreased or increased emphasis on the use of diplomacy to build bridges with Russia on this issue? And how do you think that will affect careers available in, say, foreign service or diplomacy?
Look, there's a lot going on with nuclear things, whether, just to quickly divide it, you've got what's traditionally called vertical proliferation, managing, say, the US-Russian relationship, established nuclear powers. And as I said, in February, there's a big decision to make. But even if we extend the agreement, that leaves out the question of whether China participates in future agreements, and also which systems are included. The technology is outpacing the diplomacy. So there's going to be fundamental questions about what systems and technologies are captured in future agreements. We've seen this historically. It happened when cruise missiles were invented, whenever there's new systems. So that's going to, that's a growth area, shall we say, and a real challenge, particularly against the backdrop of the current state of U.S.-Russian and U.S.-Chinese relations. Then you've got all the proliferation issues, the horizontal ones with North Korea, Iran. And if we don't manage those too well, ultimately others. Indeed, if Iran were to get nuclear weapons, or even close to them, I don't think the Saudis, the Turks, the Egyptians, and others would be far behind. And if you think the Middle East is a bad place now, just imagine that one. So I think all that's happening, and more broadly, again, it's a science issue. We still have the labs run by the Energy Department where a lot of this work takes place. So for those of you who are science oriented, indeed, we need people there because a lot of the generations that were instrumental to developing nuclear weapons, a lot of those people have retired or died. So we actually have a certain gap in people who know a lot about things nuclear. But I think, again, whether you come at it from the science point of view, the policy and diplomacy point of view, nuclear weapons remain one of the fundamental challenges and manifestations of globalization. I do not think it's going away. Disarmament is not on the horizon. Denuclearization is not coming to this North Korea. Disarmament is not coming to the United States and the Soviet Union. At best, you're going to have arms control, which just means limits of one sort or another. So again, this is no less important than it was. It's just not getting the attention that it used to when during the Cold War, when this was seen as the principal arena of U.S.-Soviet competition. I think now it's in a sense competing for attention with other things, be it pandemics or climate change, or you name it. But to those of you who are focusing on this set of issues, you will not be unemployed. I'm sorry to say, by the way. I wish I wish I felt otherwise.
So I think we have time for one more question. Drew?
Thank you both so much for your time. I'm going to direct my question to Mr. Matthiesen. I think a lot of Middlebury students are very interested in working for policy advocacy shops, like you mentioned, with those opportunities increasing, like you mentioned earlier. I was wondering if you could shed a little light on the career pathways that get you there that are sometimes shrouded in mystery, especially maybe referencing whether there are potential entry-level opportunities or internships, or if you need to earn your policy stripes in all scenarios before working for in a career like yours.
Yes, good question. So I think, and I alluded to it earlier, that the Capitol Hill is kind of the traditional way to go, or the federal government writ large, but more the Hill. And while you don't have to have that credential, it helps. And everyone, as we're all feeling each other out as lobbyists and advocates up here, you get a sense of where the person's come from politically, what his thoughts might be, but and that's important. But the most important thing is you understand how Congress works, as you know from polling and from your comments earlier. It's opaque. It makes no sense logically to a certain degree, and just knowing who the leaders are, who leads on what issues, who will be in your camp or opposed to you, that takes sort of immersing yourself in it. So I definitely recommend the Hill. There are internships, unpaid, some paid, available. A really good way to get going, and this is political though, is to work on a campaign, sort of put in your time, particularly now surrounding these important elections with your local congressperson or someone you have some interest in. And then, when they come to Washington, you can kind of get hooked up with the sort of junior level thing and then go from there. And it's a great way to get yourself a lot of power, for lack of a better word, at a very young age. You can affect policy directly in your early 20s if you're able to be on Capitol Hill. And then pivoting to my position, there are a few different ways to crack in there, but almost always they're gonna be looking from Capitol Hill. So I would recommend that. And I think now is a really good time. I mean, I know y'all are in school, but volunteering on a campaign, if you're able to be in Washington, or if there are alumni listening who are in Washington looking for a job or would like to come to Washington, there's a period starting about now where the Congress, people are leaving, people have already retired, people are going to lose those jobs. The current staffers are looking for other opportunities. Many of them have gotten them. So you can sometimes get your foot in the door for 2 months in an office that's going away, boost your resume, learn a little bit, make some relationships. So, there are a lot of opportunities starting now until about the first 3 or 4 months of a new session of Congress that will be open, and even in the summer when some people are graduating or are ready for summer jobs. So I'm happy to talk to anybody individually about that stuff as well if there's an interest there, because it's not it's not easy, but it's pretty self-explanatory.
Jeff, can I just make 2 quick points just to
Absolutely.
piggyback on that? One is we haven't talked about it, but for a lot of what we've talked about, you are going to have to think about more education. As good as this Middlebury degree is, it is rarely enough anymore. So whether it's masters or doctorates, that's for a lot of what we've talked about, that's going to be necessary either for what you learn or as a credential or both. Without it, it could be a ceiling, and with it, it could give you lots of opportunity. Again, it's partially credential, let's be honest, but also a lot of it's just you got to know certain stuff. So that's something that everybody I would think should think about. The other is how would I put it? Think tanks have got to be part of the conversation. By and large, universities are places where you get degrees, but most American universities are no longer interested in participating in the policy debates. Policy relevant work mostly does not happen out of universities. Policy relevant work tends to happen out of think tanks, mostly in Washington, to some extent in New York. And that ought to be something that you also think about. If you want to influence public policy, you can do it there. Ideas matter. It can also be a great way to learn as postdocs or pre-docs, whether it's internships or research assistant jobs at places like mine, the Council on Foreign Relations or other institutions, Brookings, what have you. But you should think about that. Again, it's part of, in your 20s, a lot of what you almost need to think about, you're investing in yourself and tooling up, and think tanks, a lot of these jobs on the Hill, in the executive branch, where have you, are great places to spend a couple of years. And I often tell people, you come spend a couple of years to council, but then we want to kick you out. Go get that advanced degree, go get that job. You can come back when you have your PhD. That's a different thing. But so I think, but at this stage of your life, when you leave campus, think about several stops in your 20s, and the ideas industry conceivably could be one of them, and further educational experience is probably also going to need to be one of them.
I wish we had time for more questions. I'd like to thank our students for joining in the conversation. That's great. I love the questions. To both of our guests, Richard and Chris, thank you so much for your contributions to our understanding the 2 possible policy futures and your advice and counsel when it comes for the students as they consider career opportunities going forward. To the audience, thank you for joining us this evening. Please stay tuned for future Live from DC episodes, which will be coming in the spring, which will dive deeper into specific policy fields with alumni and parents who are engaged professionally in those fields. Until then, good evening.